Imagine getting to see the face of someone born in the 1700s, captured not on oil paint or marble, but in an actual photograph. Sounds impossible, right? But history has a few surprises up its sleeve. In this episode of Past Paradise, we're diving into the rare and astonishing world of historic figures who were actually photographed. From Revolutionary War veterans like Hannah Stilly Gorby, possibly the earliest born person ever caught on camera, to abolitionist icons like Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, whose portraits radiate strength and defiance, these images collapse centuries into a single frame. You'll meet survivors of Napoleon's army, Civil War soldiers, and even a young Abraham Lincoln before the weight of the presidency etched itself into his features. These aren't just photos, they're time machines, offering a raw, unfiltered glimpse into lives that shaped the world long before selfies and smartphones were invented. So buckle up, because what you're about to see will make you question everything you thought you knew about the reach of photography and the people who lived long enough to be frozen in its lenses. Ulysses S. Grant, Mexican-American war soldier, 1846 to 1954. Grant served with distinction under Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott. Only paintings, or later on artists' renderings, exist. Photography remained limited to elites or studio commissions and was not common in the field. The earliest possible photographic portraits of Ulysses S. Grant date to the 1850s, during his post-war military career or brief civilian period when he struggled financially. Daguerreotypes or ambrotypes would have been used, the slow exposures requiring full stillness. Grant returned to service in 1861 at the start of the Civil War. This time, the most iconic photos of Grant were taken, coinciding with the rise of war photography. 1864, Cold Harbor, Virginia. One of the most famous images shows Grant in a slouched posture. Petersburg Campaign, 1864 to 65, Grant photographed with General Meade and other officers. City Point, Virginia, 1864. Large format photos show Grant at headquarters, professional, stoic, and symbolic of Union resolve. These battlefield photos helped show Grant humanized to public and solidify his growing saga. In 1868, he was elected as the 18th President of the United States. In 1888, he was diagnosed with throat cancer. He died on July 23, 1885. Grant was one of the first American generals and presidents to have his entire adult life visually documented. Susan B. Anthony. Susan was inspired by the Seneca Falls Convention, 1848, though she didn't attend the Seneca Falls Convention. She became active in temperance and anti-slavery movements. Her first known photo was likely taken in the 1850s, when she was in her 30s, around the same time she met Elizabeth Cady Stanton, her lifelong collaborator. Anthony and Stanton together co-founded the American Equal Rights Association, 1866, and they later split into two major suffrage organizations. Till now, photography became more accessible during this time with ambrotypes, tintypes, and albumen prints. Anthony sat for formal studio portraits frequently. She understood that images help in building recognition and legitimacy. Her photos were used in pamphlets, suffrage literature, and lecture posters. In 1872, Susan voted illegally in the presidential election in Rochester, New York, for which she was arrested, tired, and fined for a pivotal moment in her public life. Photos from this time period capture her at peak visibility, circulated in newspapers and lithographs. By the late 19th century, her photographs had exploded with the advent of cabinet cards, stereographs, and photo postcards. Susan was now a nationwide celebrity in the American suffrage movement, giving lectures across the country. She appeared in dozens of formal portraits. Now she was an icon. Her face became the visual face of American suffrage. She was frequently photographed for interviews, magazines, and even early newsreels, celebrated as a national elder stateswoman of activism. Final portraits show her aged, slightly stooped, but still commanding. She died in 1906, 14 years before women got the right to vote. 1920, 19th Amendment. Thomas Edison. In the early 1870s, Edison opened his first lab in Newark, New Jersey. His invention of the photograph in 1877 brought him international fame overnight. As photography became cheaper and more accessible, Edison embraced its use in public relations. Edison perfected the incandescent light bulb in 1879, boosting his status as the Wizard of Menlo Park. Photographers began documenting him frequently. Edison didn't just embrace photography, he helped revolutionize it. He invented the kinetoscope, early motion picture camera in the 1880s, built the Black Maria, America's first film production studio, in 1893. Thomas appeared in some of the earliest motion pictures in human history, including demonstrations of inventions. He understood the power of visual media to influence public perception, politics, and commerce. He had a famous rival, Nikola Tesla and George Westinghouse, in the War of Currents. Edison used both print media and photography to shape his image as the rightful father of electricity. Photos circulated in newspapers often presented him as hardworking, practical, and surrounded by tech and gadgets. He was photographed visiting schools and exhibitions and speaking with presidents, reinforcing his public importance. By the 1910s, Edison was a living American legend and frequent subject of formal portrait sessions, now with early film photography and halftone printing. Final portraits from the 1920s to 1930s. Edison died on October 18, 1931, at age 84. His death was heavily covered in newspapers, magazines, and newsreels. Queen Victoria. The 1850s was the year rapid advancements took place in photographic technology, calotypes, albumin prints. Prince Albert and Queen Victoria posed often in intimate domestic scenes, which was very unusual for royal families. Photography became part of the royal PR, forging a connection with the British public. In 1851, the Great Exhibition, spearheaded by Albert, was widely photographed, linking the monarchy to progress and industry. In 1861, Prince Albert died, plunging Victoria into deep depression. She wore black dresses for the rest of her life, a period that lasted 40 years. Photographs during this time reflect her grief, her retreat from public life, and a more solemn and aged monarch. These images were widely circulated. Studio portraits, cabinet cards, and stereographs showing the Queen in dark clothes, often expressionless. Despite her withdrawal, her image was more publicly visible than ever. The photos contributed to the cult of domestic sorrow and Victorian culture. 1877, Golden Jubilee, 50 years on the throne, and 1897, Diamond Jubilee, 60 years as monarch. Both jubilees were heavily photographed and filmed processions, parades, and royal appearances captured in early motion pictures. Studio portraits taken by renowned photographers like W.and.D. Downey, Victoria continued to be photographed shortly before her death. Last image shows a frail and elderly monarch, often photographed from the side or slightly downcast. Victoria died on January 22, 1901, at age 81. Oscar Wilde. Wilde toured the States in 1882, giving lectures on aesthetics and art. He famously told U.S. Customs officers, "I have nothing to declare but my genius." The tour was widely publicized and extensively photographed. Photographers like Napoleon III took some of the most iconic portraits of Wilde, reclining on a couch in silk or velvet, which is not clear from the quality of the photo. These photographs were used in press kits, promotional posters, and satirical cartoons mocking his flamboyance. Wilde understood how to use photography as branding long before modern PR existed. Wilde's fame peaked in the late 1880s and early 90s with The Picture of Dorian Gray, 1890, and Salome, 1893. Oscar was often photographed in dark three-piece suits, still with flamboyant touches. Many photos show him brooding, touching his face, or gazing dreamily, embodying Dorian Gray's aesthetic. He posed for high society photographers in London and Paris, who crafted his image as an intellectual and style icon. These images circulated in literary journals and celebrity publications of the day. In 1895, Wilde sued the Marquess of Queensberry for libel, a case that backfired catastrophically. He was arrested and put on trial for gross indecency, then sentenced to 2 years of hard labor. During the trial and imprisonment, no known photos were taken of Wilde behind bars. However, press illustrations used earlier portraits as visual references. His past photos became sensationalized and republished to reinforce his fall from grace. Upon release from prison in 1897, Oscar was physically and emotionally broken. He lived in exile in France under the name Sebastian Melmoth. Final photographs, 1898 to 1900, show a tired and sad Wilde. After his death, Wilde's photographic legacy only grew. Sojourner Truth. In the 1850s, Sojourner Truth began selling portraits of herself to raise money for her cause. She was one of the first public figures to do so intentionally. She used photographic calling cards, carte de visite, with her image and the caption, "I sell the shadow to support the substance." Enslaved people had no visual record. Truth created her own. She reclaimed control over her image, rejecting the mammy stereotype. Truth appeared dignified and composed, the opposite of how black women were portrayed at the time. Eyes focused directly on the viewer, conveying strength and moral clarity. In 1850, she published her narrative, The Narrative of Sojourner Truth, dictated to Olive Gilbert. She became a sought-after speaker at abolitionist and feminist conventions. Photographs were used as marketing tools at speaking engagements and sold to support her travel and activism. In 1861, she supported the Union cause, helped recruit black troops, met President Abraham Lincoln in 1864, a rare honor. She gave him a copy of her photograph and then worked in Washington, D.C. to improve conditions for freedmen. She continued to speak out against racism well into old age and advocated for women's suffrage, land reparations, for freed people, and prison reforms. Final portraits, 1870s to 1880s, show her frailer but still fierce. She died on November 26, 1883. Buffalo Bill Cody. In 1872, he starred in his first play, Scouts of the Prairie, a Wild West melodrama staged on the East Coast. Photography exploded during this era, with cabinet cards and carte de visite portraits used for celebrity promotion. In 1883, he founded Buffalo Bill's Wild West, a traveling show that combined circus acts, rodeos, and staged battles. The show featured sharpshooter Annie Oakley, Native American performers, and cavalry reenactments and frontier storytelling. The show was a global sensation, touring Europe and the U.S. Cody was heavily photographed for promotional posters, studio portraits, and group photos with performers. He became one of the most photographed men of the 19th century, second after the royal family members and presidents. His public image was heroic, theatrical, and distinctly American. Cody embraced new technology, using photographs in advertising, souvenir programs, and posters. His signed photographic prints were sold to fans. Early news photographers and filmmakers began covering the Wild West show. In London, 1887, Cody performed before Queen Victoria and was widely photographed with nobles and foreign dignitaries. His image became a symbol of American identity abroad, a rugged individual, expansion, and spectacle. In 1894, Cody appeared in Edison's early motion pictures, including Buffalo Bill's Wild West Parade and The Cowboy and the Indians. These films preserved his movement and persona, making him one of the first American celebrities on film. Also photographed in group portraits with his cast of horses and props, treating photography as both documentation and myth-making. The Wild West show began to decline in the early 1900s due to changing tastes and financial mismanagement. Cody continued to be photographed until he died on January 10, 1919. Leo Tolstoy. Leo Tolstoy wrote War and Peace, 1869, and Anna Karenina, 1877, during this time. Photos from this era show him sometimes with pen and paper. He began to distance himself from high society, and his photographic image reflected that. Leo underwent a moral and spiritual transformation, rejecting wealth and literacy fame. He became a Christian anarchist and pacifist, promoting nonviolence and manual labor. His appearance changed dramatically, and so did his photos. Photographed plowing fields or standing barefoot, Leo refused royalties for his works and was excommunicated by the Russian Orthodox Church in 1901. Photos became part of his message: simplicity, truth, and rejection of vanity. Tolstoy became a global celebrity, and his face was widely reproduced in postcards, newspaper, and socialist anarchist publications. Photographed by many famous Russian photographers, including Sergei Prokudin-Gorsky, early-era color photographer, he was also filmed in early motion pictures, including a few seconds of footage of him walking in his garden. His photographic images became political, used by revolutionaries for his anti-czarist views, religious reformers for his moral teachings, and pacifists and early socialists for his criticism of violence. Photos from the last decade of his life are some of the most powerful. Tolstoy seated in nature, writing or meditating. A true sage-like presence, his image now mirrored the prophetic tone of his writings. The kingdom of God is within you, what I believe, etc. Leo died on November 20, 1910, after leaving his family estate in secret to live more simply. His death and funeral were photographed and filmed, marking him as one of the first literate celebrities to die in the era of modern media coverage. P.T. Barnum. Barnum temporarily stepped away from show business to write books, for example, The Life of P.T. Barnum. Still supported himself through spectacle, even if masked in public service. These mid-career portraits often show dark suits, high collars, and seated poses. A shift in tone from flamboyant promoter to aging icon. In 1871, he launched P.T. Barnum's Grand Traveling Museum, Menagerie, Caravan, and Hippodrome, which evolved into Barnum and Bailey's Circus. He introduced the slogan, "The Greatest Show on Earth." He partnered with James A. Bailey in 1861, brought photography to the circus tent, and promoted acts using photographs in newspapers and posters, sold photo prints at shows. P.T. staged group shots of performers, animals, and crowds. Barnum himself continued to be heavily photographed. He used photos to show both personal transformation, from hoaxer to patriarch. In 1882, Barnum purchased Jumbo, the world-famous African elephant from the London Zoo. Jumbo became a photographic sensation, like posters, photographs, and collectible cards. He knew that a photo of Jumbo told the story faster than any words and used photos in newspaper syndication to sell out shows. Barnum continued to promote his shows and image until his death on April 7, 1891, at age 80. Harriet Tubman. By the late 1850s and early 1860s, Tubman was well known in abolitionist circles and became close friends with the likes of Frederick Douglass, William H. Seward, and Susan B. Anthony. First known photograph of Harriet Tubman was likely taken in the early 1860s, where her expression reflects both strength and the toll of her work. In Civil War service, she served as a scout, spy, and nurse. Most famously, she led the Combahee River Raid in 1863, liberating over 700 enslaved people, making her the first woman in U.S. history to lead a military expedition. No photos exist from the raid itself, but images from around this period show a proud, determined woman in modest working attire. After the war, Tubman settled in Auburn, New York, on land gifted by abolitionist William H. Seward. She advocated for women's suffrage, elderly care for Black Americans, and civil rights. Several studio portraits were taken in this period for fundraising and public awareness campaigns. Her photography was used in lectures, pamphlets, and abolitionist circles to promote her causes. She understood the power of image, even if she didn't seek fame. Tubman became a public elder figure of great respect. Her story circulated widely. Harriet continued to speak publicly and raise money for the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged, which she founded. Final photographs show an elderly Tubman, frail but upright, in shawls and head coverings. Harriet died in March 10, 1913, at roughly 91 years old. Her funeral was photographed, a rare honor at the time for a Black woman. Napoleon III. Napoleon was elected president on December 1848 after the Revolution of 1848 and the fall of King Louis Philippe. He was the first president of France elected by direct popular vote. Disdéry popularized the carte de visite, small photographic calling cards and portraits, often of celebrities and leaders like Napoleon III. His image was widely distributed, a novelty in political culture at the time. He made Napoleon III's image accessible to the public and helped craft a strong, regal persona. It was used for both domestic prestige and foreign diplomacy. Coup d'etat, December 2, 1851, dissolved the National Assembly, declared emperor December 1852, taking the name Napoleon III. Napoleon modernized Paris under Baron Haussmann. He pursued foreign wars, the Crimean War, 1853-56, the Italian campaigns, 1859, and the Mexican expedition, 1861-67. He advocated for economic liberalization and industrialization and commissioned official portraits for newspapers, coins, stamps, and public displays. Napoleon III created a visual culture of monarchy in the modern age. Photographs were sent internationally to portray him as a modern, powerful ruler. Empress Eugenie, his wife, was also photographed frequently and seen as a fashion icon. André Adolphe Eugene Desdery was the innovator of multi-pose carte-de-visite photographs. In the Franco-Prussian War, 1870, major defeat at the Battle of Sedan, and Napoleon was captured. His empire collapsed on September 4, 1870, and he later died on January 9, 1873. Karl Marx. Marx released the first volume of Das Kapital in 1867, and he continued to be an active member of the International Working Men's Association, First International. He maintained communication with Engels and other political militants from all over Europe by exchanging letters. Marx is depicted in his later years in the most well-known of the remaining photos. These pictures are extremely important and contributed to the elimination of stereotypes of Marx as a wild-eyed rebel and strengthened the idea that he was a serious intellectual and a dedicated thinker. The death of his wife, Jenny, in the year 1881 was among the personal tragedies that he experienced. On March 14, 1883, Karl passed away after experiencing a fast deterioration in his health. It is probable that the final images he took were shot in the early 1880s. The hollowed-out features of Marx are evident in these photos, which portray him as noticeably older and more fragile. They are the last visual record of a life that has been defined by political conflict and an enormous amount of intellectual work. There are less than 12 known images, most of which were taken between 1850 and 1882. Rare in comparison to the leaders and royalty of the time period, but nevertheless of profound importance. Chief Sitting Bull. Chief Sitting Bull led resistance against U.S. military and settlers encroaching on Lakota lands. He gained influence after Red Cloud's War, 1866-68, and refused to sign treaties that ceded Lakota land. During this time, Lakota was increasingly affected by settler presence, including photographers, but Sitting Bull remained far from colonial settlements. In 1874, U.S. General George Custer leads a gold expedition into the Black Hills, violating treaties. Sitting Bull helped unite Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho bands. On June 25, 1876, he played a spiritual leadership role in the Battle of the Little Bighorn, Custer's last stand, where Custer and over 200 U.S. soldiers were killed. The battle shocked the U.S. public and catapulted Sitting Bull into national headlines. No photos from this exact time, but journalists and photographers became increasingly interested in documenting Native leaders. Sitting Bull fled to Canada with followers after Little Bighorn to avoid U.S. retaliation and stayed in Canada for nearly 4 years. He returned to the U.S. in 1881 and surrendered at Fort Beaufort. Sitting Bull was photographed for the first time. The photos were taken by U.S. military personnel and general photographers. In 1885, he joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, a traveling performance of cowboys versus Indians. He performed in front of large crowds and earned money, but was deeply ambivalent about the experience. Sitting Bull remained a respected spiritual leader among the Lakota. U.S. authorities saw him as a symbol of resistance, especially during the rise of the Ghost Dance movement, 1889-90, which envisioned the return of native lands and ancestors. On December 15, 1890, he was killed by Indian police during an attempted arrest at Standing Rock, fearing he would incite rebellion. Hannah Stilla Gorby. By the 1790s, Hannah would have been an elderly woman if she was born in 1746, and she would have been 54 in 1800 and 90 by 1836. A lifespan of 100+ years is implied in the claims. In 1839, Louis Daguerre publicly introduces the daguerreotype process. In the U.S., photography begins to spread in the 1840s. A photograph circulated online shows an elderly woman in traditional clothing, often identified as Hannah Stilly Gorby. Based on the style of the photograph, it likely dates from the 1840s or early 1850s. If the birthday, 1746, is accurate, she would have been 94 in 1840 and 104 in 1850. The woman in the image is extremely aged and wears a bonnet and typical 19th century rural American clothing. Her expression is serious, which was common in early daguerreotypes due to long exposure times. No official provenance or museum record confirms her identity. The image appears in blog posts and viral internet claims, but no scholarly publications verify the attribution to Hannah Stilly. Some historians consider it likely misattributed or apocryphal. Despite the questionable details, Hannah Stilly Gorby's story, real or not, has become an internet phenomenon, illustrating how early photography captured people who were born before the American Revolution, possibly even before the United States existed. Hannah later died in the year 1840. Florence Nightingale. Florence volunteered to lead a team of nurses to Scutari, Turkey during the Crimean War. She found horrendous conditions, unsanitary hospitals, massive infection rates, and poor nutrition. She implemented reforms that dramatically reduced mortality rates 42% to 2%. Newspapers and artists depicted her as an angelic figure, checking on soldiers at night by lamplight. The iconic image cemented her fame, even without photographic evidence from the battlefield. War photography was in its infancy. Photographers like Roger Fenton documented the war, but Florence Nightingale avoided being photographed during this time. Only drawings and lithographs of her from this period exist, not photos. She returned to Britain a national hero, despite ill health, likely from brucellosis. She founded the Nightingale Training School for Nurses, 1860, and advised on military and public health reforms across the British Empire. She was the first woman awarded the Order of Merit by the British Crown. A small number of studio photographs taken between 1858 and the 1870s often appear reluctant, reserved, or serious, wearing dark Victorian clothing. The most well-known photo shows her seated, veiled, and slightly turned away from the camera, reflecting her desire for privacy. She continued advising on health and sanitation well into her old age. She was largely bedridden from the 1880s onward, but kept up correspondence with global health leaders and died peacefully on August 13, 1910. Roa Derry. Rhoda began displaying delusional behavior, believing she was cursed and possessed. Her symptoms included auditory hallucinations, delusions of persecution, and episodes of screaming and violence. She was admitted to Adams County Almshouse, a poorhouse offering minimal care for mental illness. Rhoda was transferred to the Illinois State Hospital for the Insane in Jacksonville. Her condition deteriorated drastically. She reportedly gouged out her own eyes with her fingers during a psychotic episode and suffered physical injuries and self-harm and was considered hopeless. Lacking any real treatment, she was deemed incurable and returned to the Adams County Almshouse. Rhoda spent over 4 decades in near total isolation, confined in a small wooden box likened to a coffin. She lived in filth with little human contact, food, or hygiene. Her body became contorted and emaciated due to prolonged neglect and physical suffering. She was blind, toothless, and partially paralyzed. Witnesses say she was often left screaming or muttering incoherently with long fingernails and twisted limbs. Dr. George Zeller, a progressive asylum superintendent, learned of Rhoda's case. He was shocked by her condition and personally ordered her transfer to Peoria State Hospital. Rhonda's new environment was clean, respectful, and humane. She was bathed and clothed and also given regular meals and allowed outside. Despite blindness, Rhoda responded positively to kindness, sometimes smiling. During her time at Peoria State Hospital, a photograph was taken. The image has become a haunting and important visual artifact. Mark Twain. Mark Twain became a licensed Mississippi River pilot in the 1850s. The name Mark is derived from the river depth terminology. After the Civil War halted river traffic, he moved west and worked as a silver prospector in Nevada and a journalist in San Francisco, and adopted the pen name Mark Twain in 1863. Earliest surviving portraits show him in his 30s, often in formal dress with a calm, reserved expression typical of the photographic style of the time. He gained national attention with The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, 1865. He published travelogues like The Innocents Abroad, 1869, showcasing his sharp wit and cultural commentary. Mark married Olivia Langdon in 1870 and moved to Hartford, Connecticut. He built his dream house there and had 3 daughters. He also posed for studio shots. Mark published The Adventure of Tom Sawyer, 1876, Life on the Mississippi, 1883, and Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, 1885. He became an international celebrity, frequently traveling and lecturing. His humor, criticism of imperialism, and disdain for hypocrisy defined his public image. Twain is often photographed in increasingly expressive poses. He transitioned from stiff Victorian portraits to more natural, sometimes mischievous images. Early photos of him in his iconic white suit appear in the 1890s. Financial troubles at the 1890s led him on a world lecture tour to repay debts. Mark continued publishing essays, novels, A Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court, The Mysterious Stranger, and autobiographical works. He died on April 21, 1910. William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman resigned from the Army in 1853 and held several civilian jobs, like banker in California, president of a military academy in Louisiana. He returned to the military as tensions escalated before the Civil War. First known photographs were likely taken in the late 1850s to early 1860s, when formal photography became more accessible and popular among public figures. He rejoined the Army in 1861 as the Civil War began and fought in major battles like the First Battle of Bull Run, 1861, the Battle of Shiloh, 1862, and the Siege of Vicksburg, 1863, most famously leading the Atlanta Campaign and the March to the Sea, 1864, devastating the Confederate infrastructure across Georgia. Post-war, William became Commanding General of the U.S. Army, 1869-83, succeeding Grant. He oversaw Reconstruction efforts and U.S. military policy during the Indian Wars. He famously refused to run for president, saying, "I will not accept if nominated and will not serve if elected." Often in civil attire, a more reflective elder statesman look compared to his wartime photos, he retired from military service in 1883, where he remained a public speaker and national figure, photographed frequently during veterans' reunions and GAR, Grand Army of the Republic events. William died on February 14, 1891. Tsar Nicholas II. Nicholas became Tsar in 1894 after the sudden death of his father. He faced growing unrest due to military failures, Russo-Japanese War, worker strikes, and demands for political reform. In 1905, Bloody Sunday and widespread protests led to the creation of the Duma, Parliament. Nicholas was portrayed as a strong, benevolent ruler, and press photos began showing crowds, protests, and military crackdowns. Nicholas was photographed attending military parades and Orthodox church services to maintain authority. Russia entered World War I in 1914. Nicholas took personal command of the army in 1915, leaving Alexandra in charge at home. The war went disastrously for Russia, heavy casualties, food shortages, and social. Meanwhile, in March 1917, Nicholas abdicated the throne, ending over 300 years of Romanov rule. The family was placed under house arrest, first at Alexander Palace, then later transferred to Tobolsk, then Ekaterinburg under Bolshevik control. Last known photos, candid snapshots of the family in captivity. Nicholas appears aged, tired, and withdrawn, yet he is still dignified. The daughters are seen walking, sewing, or sitting outside under close guard. Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln ran for Senate against Stephen A. Douglas in 1858. He lost, but gained national recognition. He delivered powerful anti-slavery arguments during the debates. Photo sessions increased as he gained fame. Portraits show him as tall, gaunt, and stern. In February 1860, Matthew Brady photographed Lincoln in New York. This photo was widely reproduced and helped him with political support in the East, said to have helped him become president by shaping a respectable image. Abraham was elected as the 16th President of the United States in November 1860. Photographers captured campaign portraits, and dozens of engravings and posters were created from these photos to distribute across the Union. His presidency was defined by the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, and preserving the Union. Throughout these years, Lincoln was photographed regularly with cabinet members, reviewing troops, signing documents, and in both solemn and formal settings. Alexander Gardner and Matthew Brady produced the most iconic wartime photos. Lincoln began to look older, wearier, and more somber as the war progressed. Abraham delivered the Gettysburg Address and the Emancipation Proclamation, 1863, and signed the Emancipation Proclamation earlier that year, marking abolition a Central Union War goal. Last known photographs taken by Alexander Gardner on February 5, 1865, just over 2 months before his death. He was assassinated on April 14, 1865, by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater 5 days after the end of the Civil War. Louisa May Alcott. To provide for her family, Louisa held a number of different positions, including that of teacher, governess, and seamstress. During the Civil War, she enlisted as a nurse for the Union Army, serving from 1862 to 1863. She developed typhoid fever and received treatment in the form of calomel, which is a mercury-based treatment. Unfortunately, this treatment resulted in health problems that continued to plague her for the rest of her life. Louisa published Little Women in 1868, which was inspired by her family and the way she was raised. Louisa put her celebrity status to good use by providing financial assistance to her family and campaigning for the rights of women. She made a reputation for herself in American literature and became a household name in the process. She was also a champion for women's suffrage. She was the first woman to register to vote in Concord, Massachusetts, the abolition of slavery, and equal access to education. Louisa continued to write novels and short stories, which she published frequently under both her name and a pseudonym. Photography was still in its early stages of development during the era in which Louisa May Alcott lived, and it was uncommon for women to take photographs, particularly if they were writers. Her photograph was taken on several different occasions, which made her one of the few female authors of the 19th century whose likeness has survived to the present day. The Orchard House Museum, which is located in Concord, served as her family's house, was the Library of Congress and Harvard University's Houghton, and the place where photographs were archived. These photographs provide a rare visual connection to one of the most cherished personalities in American literature, establishing her in historical reality outside the realm of fiction. She was already suffering from mercury poisoning, which had already caused damage to her health, and later her condition had gotten worse. She was responsible for providing care for her father until he passed away in the year 1888. 2 days following her father's death, Louisa passed away at the age of 55 on March 6, 1888. Alexander Graham Bell. On March 7, 1876, just a few hours before Elisha Gray, Alexander Graham filed an application for a patent for a similar invention. He was granted a patent in the United States, number 174,465, for the telephone. This was followed by a demonstration of the telephone at the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition in June of 1876. In the year 1877, he was one of the people who helped to establish the Bell Telephone Company, which later became known as AT&T. Alexander gained international recognition as a result of his invention. He was subjected to patent challenges and lawsuits on multiple occasions. He emerged victorious in every single case, establishing his position as the rightful legal inventor of the telephone. He proceeded to do experiments with sound, speech, and communication technology. The photophone, which was a forerunner to fiber optics, was invented by Alexander Bell, who used it to carry sound on a beam of light. He also worked in the field of aeronautics, where he was responsible for founding the Aerial Experiment Association, AEA, and assisting in the development of some of the first airplanes. While working with hydrofoil boats, Alexander designed and constructed some of the speediest watercraft that were available at the time. He was a fervent advocate for the education of those who are deaf and had a part in mentoring and supporting Helen Keller, who referred to him as the door through which I entered the world of knowledge. Throughout his life, photographers extensively shot his photo. This was especially true because his rise to fame occurred during the period when photography was growing in popularity as a medium for public consumption. Studio portraits were where his photograph was shown, and he was typically dressed in formal attire for them. Alexander continued to conduct scientific experiments up to the day he died. He passed away on August 2, 1922, at his farm in Baddeck, Nova Scotia. Booker T. Washington. The Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute, which is now known as Tuskegee University, was established in Alabama in 1881 as a new institution for black students. Washington was chosen to be the school's first leader. In addition to academic subjects, he placed a strong emphasis on the need for practical education, which included agriculture, trades, and domestic skills. He began his education in a small shanty that consisted of a single room. He believed that education was the most important factor in the process of racial advancement. As Tuskegee University became more well-known, photographers began to chronicle the school's development, its students, and Washington himself. During the Cotton States and International Exposition, which took place in Atlanta, Georgia, in 1895, Booker gave the well-known Atlanta Compromise speech. Rather than advocating for immediate civil rights, he championed the cause of black advancement through vocational training and economic self-sufficiency. Booker was willing to endure segregation in return for the opportunity to receive a basic education and economic possibilities. He was well received by white leaders who showered him with praise, but he was also condemned by other people, including black W.E.B. Du Bois, for being excessively obliging. Booker served as an informal advisor to a number of presidents of the United States of America, including Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. He made history in 1901 by becoming the first African American to ever be invited to the White House for dinner with the president who was in office at the time, Theodore Roosevelt. This event resulted in a national scandal, particularly in the southern states, and it spread abroad, earning donations and garnering recognition from all over the world. Up from Slavery, which became a worldwide blockbuster, was published in 1901. It was the autobiography of Booker T. Washington. Booker dedicated his time to raising money for black education, advocating for it, and giving speeches about it. He also wrote about his life, which began with slavery and ended with him holding a prominent position in the field of education. In the year 1900, Booker established the National Negro Business League. On November 14, 1915, he passed away in Tuskegee, Alabama. John Brown. Brown and 5 of his sons relocated to Kansas Territory in the middle of the 1850s with the intention of fighting against settlers who supported slavery. It was at this period that Brown became recognized to the general public as early daguerreotypes, which were an early photographic method of him, began to circulate. John traveled to the northern regions of the United States and to Canada to collect financial support and recruit people to join the cause of an armed slave rebellion. He received covert support from a group of influential abolitionists from the North who were known as the Secret Six. John had plans in 1858 to take control of the firearms that were stored in the United States Armory in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which is now West Virginia, and to use them to encourage a widespread slave revolt. On October 16, 1859, Brown and 21 of his comrades launched an assault on the armory at Harper's Ferry. Robert E. Lee, who was in charge of the United States Marine Corps, took action, along with the local militia, to swiftly put down and poorly execute him. He was taken prisoner, and 2 of his sons were slaughtered. Following his capture, John was extensively shot, and his image was widely disseminated. His calm attitude and steely stare helped build his popular image as a martyr to abolition. His trial was for treason against the state of Virginia, murder, and encouraging slaves to take part in an insurrection. After being found guilty, John was sentenced to death. Throughout the course of the trial, he did not hesitate to reiterate his position against slavery. On December 2, 1859, at Charlestown, Virginia, he was hanged to death. Not long before he was executed by abolitionists, his final portrait was shot in the circles of people who sought to end slavery. Clara Barton. Clara taught in various schools in New England and New Jersey. In 1852, she opened one of the first free public schools in New Jersey. In 1854, Clara moved to Washington, D.C. and became a clerk at the U.S. Patent Office, one of the first women to work in a federal government job. She faced gender discrimination and was eventually demoted and then reinstated. When the Civil War broke out, Barton began organizing relief efforts for Union soldiers. She collected and distributed medical supplies, bandages, and clothing. In 1862, she gained permission to bring her supplies to the front lines, a rare honor for a woman. Clara served on several battlefields. She became known as the Angel of the Battlefield for her tireless work and bravery. She was photographed during and after the war, often in modest dress, with a composed, determined expression, projecting both professionalism and compassion. Clara assisted with efforts to locate missing soldiers after the war. Clara founded the Office of Missing Soldiers, receiving over 63,000 inquiries and helping identify over 22,000 missing men. She gave lectures across the country on her war experiences, becoming a national figure. During this period, she posed for many formal portraits used to promote her public lectures and humanitarian work. During a stay in Europe, she learned about the International Red Cross and its work during the Franco-Prussian War. Clara volunteered with the Red Cross in Europe and received the Iron Cross of Merit from Germany. She returned to the U.S. and campaigned to establish an American branch of the Red Cross. In 1881, Clara founded the American Red Cross and served as its first president. She led the Red Cross in responding to major national disasters, including the Johnstown Flood, 1889, the Galveston Hurricane, 1900, and the Spanish-American War, 1898. She also provided international aid during conflicts in Cuba and Armenia. She advocated for a broader Red Cross mission beyond wartime, aid into disaster and humanitarian relief. She died on April 12, 1912. Franz Liszt. Franz traveled and visited a number of European countries, including Germany, Italy, and Russia, as part of his extensive concert tours. He caused an unusual level of panic among fans, which became known as Lisztomania. The pianos that he played on in the early days were not able to keep up with his speed and strength. Prior to his time, solo piano recitals were not a widespread phenomenon. He was the first to make them popular. Photography was only beginning to emerge during this time, and Liszt was among the first musicians to have their picture taken. The majority of these photographs were done in the style of the daguerreotype. His touring career came to an end in 1847, and he chose to make Weimar, Germany, his new home. His appointment as Kapellmeister, music director, at the court of Weimar was made official. Composing, conducting, and providing guidance to younger composers were the primary concerns of Franz. Wagner, Berlioz, and Schumann all had their pieces premiered by him. He is the author of a number of significant pieces, including the Piano Sonata in B minor, the Faust Symphony, and the Hungarian Rhapsodies. This time, which was more peaceful and focused on self-reflection, saw him taking photographs more often. As Franz became older, religion became a significant part of his life. He was given the title Abbé Litz after being ordained to minor orders in the Catholic Church in the year 1865. His life was simple, and he wore clothing that was reminiscent of the church, despite the fact that he was not a priest. He wrote sacred music in Christus, which is an oratorio, and Via Crucis, which is also known as Stations of the Cross. He was shown in numerous photos taken during the latter part of his career in priestly garb, wearing a sad and thoughtful expression on his face. Rome, Weimar, and Budapest were the three cities that Franz called home. He coached composers such as Edvard Grieg, Karl Tausig, and Hans von Bülow, and he also gave master classes. His health deteriorated throughout the 1880s, but it continued to improve until he passed away. He ultimately died on July 31, 1886. Garibaldi. He fled Italy after participating in a failed insurrection and spent over a decade in South America, especially in Brazil. Fought alongside rebels in the Ragamuffin War. He became a national hero during the Uruguayan Civil War. He returned to Italy during the revolutions of 1848 and helped establish the Roman Republic, 1849, alongside Mazzini. He led daring battles against the French, Neapolitan and Austrian forces trying to crush the Republic. Garibaldi was defeated by French troops. He fled with his wife, Anita, who died during their retreat. Daguerreotypes and lithographs from this period helped mythologize his image. In 1859, Garibaldi led the famous expedition of the 1,000 Mile with 1,000 volunteers in red shirts sailing from Genoa to Sicily. He defeated Bourbon forces and conquered the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies and handed over the territory to King Victor Emmanuel II, facilitating the unification of Italy. This is when Garibaldi became one of the most photographed men in the world. Garibaldi attempted to march on Rome in 1862 and 1867, but was stopped by Italian and French troops. He fought for other causes, helped France during the Franco-Prussian War, 1870-71, and advocated for oppressed nationalities in Europe. Garibaldi served briefly in the Italian Parliament, though more symbolic than political. He retired to his island home on Caprera, where he farmed and wrote memoirs. Garibaldi maintained correspondence with revolutionaries around the world and died on June 2, 1882. He was honored across Europe and South America. Ludwig van Beethoven. In 1787, Ludwig made his first visit to Vienna to study with Mozart, but quickly returned home due to his mother's illness. In 1792, he moved permanently to Vienna to study with Joseph Haydn and later also studied with Salieri. In the late 1790s, he gained fame as a virtuoso pianist. Ludwig composed early works in piano sonatas, trios, and his first symphony, 1800. He was supported by noble patrons, including Prince Lichnowsky. His gradual hearing loss began in 1789. He started noticing symptoms of deafness, leading to anxiety and depression. In 1802, Ludwig writes the Haugenstadt Testament, a letter to his brothers expressing despair over his growing deafness and suicidal thoughts, but also reaffirms his commitment to music. 1803-12 was known as his heroic period, where he composed groundbreaking works in Symphony No. 3 Eroica, 1803, originally dedicated to Napoleon, later rescinded, and in Symphony No. 5, 1808, the iconic fate-knocking motif. He pushed the boundaries of classical form and emotional expression. Ludwig's deafness worsened by 1814. He was functionally deaf. Ludwig started using conversation books, notebooks in which others wrote to him. He became embroiled in a custody battle over his nephew Karl after his brother's death. In 1815, brother Caspar Karl died and Ludwig became co-guardian of Karl. He composed some of his most profound and complex music, like piano sonatas Op. 106, Hammerklavier, Op. 111, and Missa Solemnis, 1823, which was massive sacred choral work. He later suffered from liver disease and died on March 26, 1827 in Vienna. His music was used in political revolutions and social causes. Charles Darwin. In 1831, Charles sailed aboard HMS Beagle as a naturalist. The voyage circumnavigates the globe, focusing on South America, the Galapagos Islands, and Australia. Darwin returned to England in 1836 and began writing and researching. He studied specimens and geology and read Malthus's essay on population, 1838, which influenced his thinking on survival and competition. He kept the theory largely private for over 20 years, fearing public backlash and religious controversy. He conducted numerous experiments and corresponded with other scientists. In 1858, Darwin was prompted to publish after receiving a manuscript from Alfred Russel Wallace with similar ideas on natural selection. In 1859, Charles published On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. The book became an immediate bestseller. It argues that species evolve over time and evolution occurs through natural selection, the survival and reproduction of the fittest individuals. Charles faced significant religious and scientific opposition, but also support. He published several follow-up works on The Descent of Man, 1871, which applies evolutionary theory to human origins and behavior. Charles studied climbing plants, orchids, and earthworms. He suffered from chronic illness for much of his life, possibly Chagas disease or psychosomatic in origin. His public image was that he became a scientific celebrity, especially later in life. He was frequently photographed. He died on April 19, 1882. Charles was the founder of modern evolutionary biology. His well-known photos were taken from Julia Margaret Cameron, famous Victorian photographer. Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Corps of Engineers. He served in various posts across the country, building forts, bridges, and other infrastructure. He served under General Winfield Scott during the Mexican-American War. Lee distinguished himself in several battles and earned a reputation as a brilliant engineer and leader under fire. He was promoted and assigned to various military posts. Lee served as superintendent of West Point, 1852-55, and became lieutenant colonel of the 2nd U.S. Cavalry. In 1859, he helped suppress John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, increasing his profile in national security matters. In 1861, at the outbreak of the Civil War, he was offered command of the Union Army by President Lincoln, but declined out of loyalty to Virginia, despite personally opposing secession. Lee initially served as a military advisor to Confederate President Jefferson Davis and assumed command of the Army of Northern Virginia in June 1862. Lee won major battles like the 7 Days Battles, the Second Battle of Bull Run, Manassas, the Battle of Fredericksburg, and the Battle of Chancellorsville, despite losing General Stonewall Jackson. He was known for daring tactics and leadership, admired even by Union opponents. In July 1863, Robert E. Lee was defeated at the Battle of Gettysburg, a major turning point in the war. Lee accepted full responsibility for the failure. He faced off against General Ulysses S. Grant in brutal, grinding campaigns. On April 9th, he surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, effectively ending the Civil War. His dignity and humility at the surrender became legendary. Lee became president of Washington College in Lexington, Virginia, now Washington and Lee University. He advocated for reconciliation and education. Those opposed continued resistance to Union authority. Lee lived quietly, refusing to write memoirs or speak ill of others publicly. He died on October 12th of 1870 due to a stroke at age 63. George Armstrong Custer. In 1861, George was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Union Army. He quickly rose through the ranks due to bravery and bold tactics and connections. In 1863, at age 23, he was promoted to Brigadier General of Volunteers, one of the youngest generals in Union history. He served in the Cavalry Corps of the Army of the Potomac. Some of his key battles were Gettysburg, 1863, where he led successful cavalry charges that helped counter Confederate forces. In 1865, he was promoted to Major General of Volunteers. He was present at Appomattox Courthouse for Lee's surrender. After the Civil War, Custer was reverted to the permanent rank of lieutenant colonel in the regular army. He was assigned to the 7th U.S. Cavalry, stationed on the western frontier. He played a major role in the U.S. government's effort to suppress Native American tribes resisting westward expansion. He was known for aggressive tactics and a high-risk leadership style. Court-martialed in 1867 for being AWOL, leaving post to see his wife Libby, his treatment of troops and misconduct, suspended for a year, but returned to duty early. He built a reputation as both a brilliant cavalry leader and a reckless self-promoter. Custer led an expedition against a large gathering of Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho under leaders such as Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and Gall. He divided his forces into 3 groups, a fatal tactical error. Custer and over 260 men of the 7th Cavalry were killed in what became known as Custer's Last Stand. His entire immediate command was wiped out. It is one of the most famous defeats in U.S. military history. Public reaction was a mix of shock, outrage, and mythologizing. Custer was lionized as a fallen hero and martyr in the immediate aftermath. Walt Whitman. In 1855, Walt Whitman published the first edition of Leaves of Grass at his own expense. Only 12 poems, but revolutionary in style and subject. It featured free verse, erotic imagery, and celebration of the body, nature, and American democracy. He included a bold frontispiece photograph, Whitman as the everyman poet in an open shirt and slouch hat. He received praise from Ralph Waldo Emerson, who said it represented the beginning of a great career. Whitman continuously revived and expanded Leaves of Grass throughout his life. Final deathbed edition in 1892 had nearly 400 poems. Major editions included Song of Myself. In 1861, Walt was profoundly affected by the American Civil War. He moved to Washington, D.C. to care for wounded soldiers as a volunteer nurse. Walt Whitman wrote some of his most emotional and humanistic poems during this period. He became a close observer of American suffering and resilience. He formed a deep admiration for Abraham Lincoln, whom he never met but often wrote about. In 1865, Walt Whitman gained more literary acclaim, though mainstream acceptance was slow. He published Democratic Vistas, 1871, a prose work on American democracy. Walt Whitman lived modestly, often in financial hardship. He suffered a stroke in 1873, moved to Camden, New Jersey, where he lived until his death. Walt Whitman wrote prose reflections and letters and continued working on Leaves of Grass. He later died on March 26, 1892. He is regarded today as a champion of democracy, individualism, equality, and the human body. Emily Dickinson. When Emily was a teenager, she was inspired by transcendentalism as well as by poets such as Ralph Waldo Emerson, William Wordsworth, and Elizabeth Barrett, and she started composing poetry. In the years after the start of her 20s, she made it a point to stay in Amherst as much as possible, and she engaged in extensive written communication with a small number of important people, such as Susan Gilbert Dickinson and Samuel Bowles, who was the editor of a newspaper. This era was the moment when her poetic creativity burst forth. She penned about 800 poems during this period and frequently wrote them on scraps of paper, envelopes, or in fascicles, which are booklets that are made by hand. Death, nature, immortality, faith, and identity are some of the most frequently recurring themes in her work. Emily was known as a recluse due to the fact that she hardly left her family's house, had a habit of wearing white clothing. She would only communicate with guests by leaving them notes or by speaking to them from behind a closed door. Emily remained in contact with a selective group of people through intensely emotional letters. Although there were even fewer poems that were shared during this time, she continued to write poetry. Afterwards, she passed away on May 15, 1886, at the age of 55. It is believed that her death was caused by Bright's disease, which is a type of kidney condition. Lavinia Dickinson, her sister, found a collection of more than 1,899 poems after she passed away. Frederick Douglass. In 1841, Frederick Douglass spoke at an anti-slavery meeting and quickly gained national attention as a powerful speaker. He became a lecturer for the American Anti-Slavery Society, working with William Lloyd Garrison. In 1845, he published his first autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, a major bestseller in both the U.S. and Europe. He traveled to Ireland and the UK, 1845-47, to escape threats of recapture and raise support for abolition. British supporters helped purchase his legal freedom from his former enslaver. He returned to the U.S. and founded the North Star, an anti-slavery newspaper based in Rochester, New York. Douglass wrote and spoke on issues beyond slavery, like women's rights, education, and labor. He advocated for political action, unlike some pacifist abolitionists. Douglass strongly supported the Union cause and pushed for abolition of slavery and the recruitment of black soldiers, and met with President Abraham Lincoln multiple times. He urged equal pay and fair treatment for black troops, praised Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, 1863, but continued to press for full equality. After the Civil War, Douglass became a national voice for black civil rights, voting rights, and equal protection under the law. He published additional autobiographies like My Bondage and My Freedom, 1855, and Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, 1881, revised 1892. He supported the 15th Amendment, black man's suffrage, though he was disappointed it didn't include women. He became a symbol of dignity and intellect for freed black Americans. He was appointed to multiple federal posts like U.S. Marshal for D.C., Recorder of Deeds for D.C., and U.S. Minister to Haiti, 1889–91. He continued writing and speaking on race, justice, and American ideals. He died on February 20, 1895 at his home, Cedar Hill, in Washington, D.C. Douglass left behind a legacy of courage, eloquence, and relentless pursuit of justice. Thanks for watching Past Paradise, where Hollywood legends come home. If you enjoyed today's look into historic figures who were actually photographed, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell. Got a star or story you want next? Drop it in the comments. Until then, keep the nostalgia alive, only on Past Paradise.
If you've watched the video till here, that means you've enjoyed the video. Subscribe. Don't forget to turn on the notifications bell icon